The rain poured heavily, drenching the quiet streets of the small town. The dim glow of streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, creating a somber atmosphere. A woman in her early 30s walked briskly down the sidewalk, her hood pulled up to shield her face from the rain. She moved with purpose, her step steady and confident, though her expression was calm and unreadable. To anyone passing by, she looked like an ordinary person heading home after a long day. But she was far from ordinary. She had been a Navy SEAL for over a decade, trained in combat, survival, and intelligence. Her skills were unmatched, and her ability to stay calm under pressure had saved lives in some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. But tonight, she wasn't on a mission in some far-off country. She was back in her hometown, trying to live a quiet life after years of service. Or so she thought. As she turned the corner onto a quieter street, she noticed a patrol car slowly following her. The headlights were off, and the car moved at a crawl, almost as if it was stalking her. She didn't react immediately, but her instincts kicked in. She knew something was off. The car stopped a few feet behind her, and two officers stepped out. They were dressed in full uniform, but something about their demeanor felt wrong. Their eyes were sharp, their movements calculated. "Ma'am, can we have a word?" one of the officers called out, his voice firm but not overly aggressive. She stopped and turned to face them, keeping her hands visible. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked, her tone calm and respectful. The second officer stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt near his weapon. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. Mind telling us what you're doing out here at this hour?" She glanced around the empty street. "I was just heading home. I live a few blocks away." The first officer nodded, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you have any ID on you?" She reached into her pocket slowly, pulling out her wallet and handing over her driver's license. The officer took it, studying it for a moment before exchanging a quick glance with his partner. Something about the way they looked at each other made her uneasy. She had seen that look before, on the faces of people who were hiding something. "All right, ma'am," the first officer said, handing her ID back. "We're going to need you to come with us to the station for some questions." She raised an eyebrow. "Questions about what?" "I haven't done anything wrong." The second officer stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, almost threatening tone. "We'll discuss that at the station. Now, please come with us." She hesitated for a moment, weighing her options. She could easily take both of them down if she wanted to, her training had prepared her for far worse. But she also knew that causing a scene with law enforcement would only make things more complicated. Reluctantly, she nodded and allowed them to lead her to the patrol car. As they drove to the station, she kept her eyes on the officers, studying their every move. The way they spoke to each other in hushed tones, the way they avoided her gaze, it all pointed to something being very wrong. She had dealt with corrupt officials before, both overseas and at home, and she knew the signs. These men weren't just doing their jobs. They had an agenda. When they arrived at the station, they led her to a small interrogation room. The walls were bare, and the only furniture was a table and two chairs. The officers told her to sit and left the room, closing the door behind them. She sat quietly, her mind racing as she tried to piece together what was happening. Why had they brought her here? What did they want from her? A few minutes later, the door opened, and a different officer walked in. He was older, with a stern expression and a badge that identified him as a detective. He sat down across from her, placing a file on the table. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked, his voice calm but probing. She shook her head. "No, I don't. The officers who brought me in said there were reports of suspicious activity, but I haven't done anything wrong." The detective opened the file and glanced at the contents before looking back at her. "We have reason to believe you're involved in a series of recent crimes in this area. Break-ins, thefts, even an assault. Her eyes widened in surprise. That's impossible. I just moved back to town a few weeks ago. I've been keeping to myself, staying out of trouble. The detective leaned forward, his gaze intense. We have witnesses who say otherwise. And we have evidence that places you at the scene of at least one of these crimes. She felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Someone had set her up. But who? And why? I want to speak to a lawyer, she said firmly, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. The detective nodded, standing up. That's your right. But just so you know, things will go a lot smoother if you cooperate. He left the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She knew she was in a dangerous situation. If these cops were corrupt, they could easily fabricate evidence to keep her locked up, or worse. But she also knew she wasn't defenseless. She had skills and training that most people couldn't even imagine. If they thought they could intimidate her, they were in for a rude awakening. As she sat there, waiting for her lawyer, she began to formulate a plan. She would play along for now, but if things took a turn for the worse, she was ready to fight back. These cops had no idea who they were dealing with. And by the time they found out, it would be too late. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. She sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room. Her mind sharp and focused despite the tension in the air. The detective had left her alone, but she knew better than to let her guard down. The walls had ears, and the cameras in the corners of the room were undoubtedly recording her every move. She kept her posture relaxed, her hands resting lightly on the table, but her eyes were constantly scanning, analyzing, and preparing. After what felt like hours, the door finally creaked open. A man in a suit walked in, carrying a briefcase. He was in his late 40s, with a calm demeanor and sharp eyes that immediately assessed the situation. He introduced himself as her court-appointed lawyer, but she could tell he was experienced, probably someone who had seen his fair share of shady police tactics. I've been briefed on your case, he said, sitting down across from her. But I want to hear it from you. What happened? She took a deep breath and explained everything, how she had been walking home, how the officers had stopped her, and how they had brought her in under vague accusations. She didn't mention her military background, not yet. It wasn't the time. The lawyer listened carefully, nodding occasionally and jotting down notes. They're claiming you were involved in a string of crimes, he said, flipping through the file the detective had left behind. But the evidence is thin. Witness statements are shaky, and the physical evidence they have is circumstantial at best. She leaned forward slightly, her voice low but firm. I didn't do this. Someone's setting me up. The lawyer studied her for a moment, then nodded. I believe you. But we need to figure out who's behind this and why. Do you have any enemies? Anyone who might want to see you in trouble? She shook her head. I've been out of the country for years. Just got back. I don't even know many people here anymore. The lawyer sighed, closing the file. All right. For now, we'll focus on getting you out of here. They don't have enough to hold you for long, but we need to be careful. These cops, they're not playing fair. She knew he was right. The system was stacked against her, and if the cops were corrupt, they could easily twist the truth to keep her locked up. But she wasn't about to sit back and let that happen. She had faced worse odds before and come out on top. This was no different. A few hours later, after a tense negotiation with the prosecutor, the lawyer managed to secure her release. The charges hadn't been dropped, but they couldn't hold her without more concrete evidence. As she walked out of the station, the rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy with tension. She knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The lawyer handed her his card as they stood outside the station. Call me if anything comes up. And be careful. These guys don't like losing. She nodded, tucking the card into her pocket. Thanks. I'll be in touch. As she walked away, she could feel the eyes of the officers on her, watching her every move. She didn't look back. Instead, she focused on what she needed to do next. If someone was setting her up, she needed to find out who, and fast. She headed straight to her apartment, a small, nondescript place on the edge of town. It was modest, but it served its purpose. As soon as she stepped inside, she locked the door and began to methodically search the place. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew better than to take any chances. If the cops were willing to frame her, they might have planted something in her home to strengthen their case. After a thorough search, she found nothing out of the ordinary. That was a relief, but it didn't answer the bigger question: why her? Why would someone go to such lengths to set her up? She had no enemies in town, no connections to anyone who might want to hurt her. The only thing that made sense was that this was random, a case of mistaken identity or a convenient scapegoat. But her instincts told her otherwise. This felt personal. She sat down at her small kitchen table, pulling out a notebook and pen. She began to jot down everything she knew, mapping out the events of the past few days. The officers who had arrested her, the detective who had interrogated her, the vague accusations, it all pointed to a coordinated effort. But by whom? As she thought about it, a memory surfaced. A few days ago, she had been at a local cafe, minding her own business, when a man had approached her. He was in his 50s, with a sharp suit and an air of authority. He had struck up a conversation, asking her about her life and where she was from. She had been polite but guarded, giving him little information. At the time, she had thought nothing of it. But now, she wondered if that encounter had been more than just small talk. She made a note of it, adding it to her growing list of clues. It wasn't much, but it was a starting point. If she could find out who that man was, she might be able to unravel the mystery. The next morning, she decided to pay a visit to the cafe. It was a long shot, but she had to start somewhere. As she walked in, the familiar scent of coffee and pastries greeted her. She ordered a drink and took a seat near the window, keeping an eye on the door. She didn't know if the man would show up again, but she was prepared to wait. Hours passed, and the cafe grew busy with the lunchtime crowd. Just as she was about to give up, she saw him. The man from before walked in, dressed in the same sharp suit. He ordered a coffee and took a seat at a table near the back, pulling out a newspaper and reading it casually. She waited a few minutes, then stood and walked over to his table. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. He looked up, surprised but not alarmed. "Of course," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. She sat down, studying him carefully. Up close, he looked even more polished, with an air of confidence that suggested he was used to being in control. "I don't think we've been properly introduced," she said, keeping her tone light. He cut her off with a smile. "I know who you are. And I think you're starting to figure out who I am." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. "And who is that?" He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on the table. "Let's just say I'm someone who knows a lot about what's going on in this town. And I think you and I could help each other." She didn't respond immediately, letting his words sink in. This man was clearly connected, and he knew something about her situation. But was he an ally, or another enemy? "What do you want?" she asked finally, her voice steady. He smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "I want to make sure the right people are held accountable. And I think you're just the person to help me do that." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze locked on his. "And if I say no?" His smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "Then I'm afraid things might get a lot worse for you." The threat was clear, but she didn't flinch. She had faced worse than this man's empty promises and veiled threats. But she also knew that playing along might be her best chance to uncover the truth. "All right," she said finally. "Tell me what you know." The man across the table studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to gauge her sincerity. She kept her expression neutral, her posture relaxed but alert. She had dealt with men like him before, men who thought they held all the cards, men who underestimated her. She wasn't about to let him see even a flicker of doubt or fear. "You're smarter than you look," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "I'll give you that." She didn't respond, waiting for him to continue. She knew better than to interrupt. People like him loved to hear themselves talk, and the more he said, the more she could learn. "There's a group in this town," he began, his voice low and measured. "A group of people who think they're untouchable. Cops, politicians, even some business owners. They've been running things behind the scenes for years, lining their pockets and covering their tracks. But lately, they've gotten sloppy. Too confident. And that's where you come in." She raised an eyebrow. "Me? I'm just a civilian. What makes you think I can do anything about it?" He smirked, a knowing look in his eyes. "Don't play dumb. I know who you are. Or at least, I know enough to know you're not just some random person they picked off the street. You've got skills. Resources. And you're in a position to help me bring them down." She felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't let it show. How much did he know about her past? About her training? She had been careful to keep a low profile since returning to town, but clearly, she hadn't been careful enough. "And what's in it for you?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. "If you're so connected, why do you need me?" His smirk faded, replaced by a grim expression. "Let's just say I have my reasons. Personal reasons. But that's not important right now. What's important is that we work together. You help me take them down, and I'll make sure your name is cleared. You walk away clean, and they get what's coming to them." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. "And if I say no?" He shrugged, but there was a coldness in his eyes that made her skin crawl. "Then you're on your own. And trust me, you don't want to be on your own in this town. Not with the kind of people you're up against." She didn't respond immediately, letting his words hang in the air. She knew he was right about one thing: she was up against powerful people. But she also knew that trusting him could be just as dangerous. Still, she didn't have many options. If she wanted to clear her name and find out who was behind this, she needed to play along, for now. "All right," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'll help you. But on one condition." He raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "You tell me everything you know. No secrets, no half-truths. If we're going to do this, I need to know what I'm walking into." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. But we'll need to move quickly. They're already onto you, and they won't stop until they've got you locked up, or worse." She nodded, her mind already racing with plans and contingencies. She didn't trust him, but she didn't need to. All she needed was information. Once she had that, she could figure out her next move. Over the next hour, he filled her in on the details. The group he was talking about was a network of corrupt officials and local power players who had been running illegal operations in the town for years. Drug trafficking, money laundering, even human smuggling. They had their hands in everything, and they had the police in their pockets. Anyone who tried to stand up to them ended up disappearing, or worse. "They've got eyes everywhere," he warned. "You can't trust anyone. Not the cops, not the lawyers, not even your neighbors. If they think you're a threat, they'll come after you." She listened carefully, taking mental notes. This was bigger than she had thought, but it also gave her a clearer picture of what she was up against. If she could find evidence of their crimes, she could bring them down. But it wouldn't be easy. She would need to be careful, methodical, and above all, patient. When he was finished, she stood up, extending her hand. "All right. We have a deal. But remember, no secrets." He shook her hand, his grip firm but not overly aggressive. "No secrets. But remember, you're in this now. There's no turning back." She nodded, then turned and walked out of the cafe, her mind already working on a plan. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she didn't need to. She had her own skills, her own resources. And she wasn't about to let anyone, corrupt cops or otherwise, take her down without a fight. As she walked down the street, she noticed a black sedan parked a few blocks away. The windows were tinted, but she could feel the eyes watching her. She didn't react, didn't even glance in their direction. Let them watch. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She headed back to her apartment, locking the door behind her and pulling out her laptop. It was time to get to work. She had a lot of research to do, and not much time to do it. But if there was one thing she was good at, it was finding the truth, no matter how well it was hidden. Over the next few days, she dug deep, using every skill she had learned in her years as a Navy SEAL. She hacked into databases, tracked down leads, and pieced together the puzzle one clue at a time. It was slow, painstaking work, but she was making progress. She uncovered names, connections, and even a few locations that seemed to be central to the group's operations. But the more she learned, the more dangerous it became. She started noticing strange things: cars following her, people watching her from a distance, even a break-in attempt at her apartment. They were getting bolder, more desperate. And that told her one thing: she was getting close. One night, as she was reviewing her notes, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was short and to the point: "You're in over your head. Back off, or you'll regret it." She stared at the screen for a moment, then deleted the message. She wasn't about to back off. Not now. Not when she was so close. But as she sat there in the dim light of her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot worse. She had made enemies, powerful ones. And they weren't going to stop until they had silenced her, for good. The text message lingered in her mind like a shadow, but she didn't let it shake her focus. If anything, it confirmed she was on the right track. The corrupt network was feeling the pressure, and their threats were a sign of weakness. She knew they would try to intimidate her, maybe even hurt her, but she wasn't about to back down. Not after everything she had uncovered. Over the past few days, she had pieced together a clearer picture of the group's operations. They were using a local shipping company as a front for their illegal activities. Drugs, weapons, and even people were being smuggled through the town's port under the guise of legitimate cargo. The company was owned by a man named Victor, a wealthy businessman with ties to the police and local government. He was the linchpin of the entire operation, and if she could bring him down, the rest would crumble. But taking down someone like Victor wouldn't be easy. He was well protected, with a small army of enforcers and corrupt cops at his disposal. She would need solid evidence, something undeniable that would expose him and his network to the public. And to get that, she would need to get close to him. She spent the next few days planning her next move. She couldn't just walk into Victor's office and demand answers. She needed to be smart, strategic. She decided to start by infiltrating the shipping company. If she could get inside, she might be able to find the evidence she needed. Disguising herself as a temporary worker, she applied for a job at the company. Her cover story was simple: she was new in town and needed work. The hiring manager, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense attitude, barely glanced at her resume before handing her a uniform and a schedule. "You start tomorrow," the woman said. don't be late." The next morning, she arrived at the shipping yard early, blending in with the other workers. The place was a maze of shipping containers, forklifts, and loading docks. It was chaotic, but that worked to her advantage. No one paid her much attention as she moved through the yard, observing everything. She kept her head down and did her job, loading and unloading cargo like the rest of the workers. But her eyes were always scanning, her mind always working. She noticed small details, the way certain containers were marked, the way certain workers seemed to have special access to certain areas. She also noticed the security cameras, positioned to cover every inch of the yard. She would need to be careful. During her lunch break, she struck up a conversation with one of the older workers, a man named Joe who had been with the company for years. He was friendly and talkative, and she quickly realized he knew more about the company than he let on. "So, how long have you been working here?" she asked casually, taking a bite of her sandwich. Joe shrugged. "Too long. But it pays the bills, you know?" She nodded. "Yeah, I get that. Seems like a pretty big operation. Must be a lot going on here." Joe chuckled. "You have no idea. This place is like its own little world. And trust me, not everything is as it seems." She raised an eyebrow, feigning curiosity. "What do you mean?" Joe glanced around, then leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Let's just say there's more to this place than meets the eye. Some of the stuff that comes through here, let's just say it's not exactly legal." She pretended to look surprised. "Really? Like what?" Joe hesitated, then shook his head. "I've said too much already. Just keep your head down and do your job. Trust me, you don't want to get involved in any of that." She nodded, but inside, she was already planning her next move. Joe's words confirmed what she already suspected: the shipping company was at the center of the corruption. And if she could find proof, she could bring the whole operation down. That night, after her shift, she returned to her apartment and began to map out the shipping yard from memory. She marked the locations of the security cameras, the restricted areas, and the containers that seemed to be of particular interest. She also made note of the workers who seemed to be in on the operation, the ones who moved with a sense of purpose and authority. The next day, she returned to work, this time with a plan. She waited until the yard was at its busiest, then slipped away from her assigned area and made her way to one of the restricted zones. She moved quickly but carefully, avoiding the cameras and staying out of sight. When she reached the container she had marked the night before, she pulled out a small lock-picking kit and went to work. It took her less than a minute to open the container. Inside, she found exactly what she was looking for: stacks of cash, bags of drugs, and a ledger detailing the company's illegal activities. She quickly snapped photos of everything with her phone, then closed the container and relocked it. As she turned to leave, she heard voices approaching. She ducked behind a stack of crates, holding her breath as two men walked past, talking in low tones. She recognized one of them as Victor, the man she had seen in photos during her research. He was taller in person, with a commanding presence that made it clear he was in charge. "We need to move the shipment tonight," Victor was saying. "The cops are getting too nosy. If they find out what's really going on here, we're all screwed." The other man nodded. "I'll take care of it. But what about the new girl? She's been asking a lot of questions." Victor's expression darkened. "Keep an eye on her. If she's a problem, deal with her. We can't afford any loose ends." She felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't move. She waited until they were gone, then slipped out of the restricted area and back to her assigned post. She knew she was running out of time. If Victor suspected her, she would need to act fast. That night, she sent the photos she had taken to her lawyer, along with a detailed explanation of what she had found. She also reached out to the man from the cafe, the one who had offered to help her. She didn't trust him, but she needed all the allies she could get. "I've got proof," she told him over the phone. "But I need your help to make sure it gets to the right people." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a slow, deliberate response. "You've done well. But be careful. Victor's not going to let this go easily. He'll come after you." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I know. But I'm ready." As she hung up the phone, she felt a sense of determination wash over her. She had the evidence she needed. Now it was time to bring the fight to them. But as she sat there in the dim light of her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. Victor and his network were powerful, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. She would need to be smarter, faster, and stronger than ever before. And she would need to be ready for anything. The next morning, she woke up early, her mind already racing with plans and contingencies. She knew Victor and his network would be on high alert after her discovery, and she couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Every move she made from this point forward would need to be calculated and precise. She started by securing the evidence she had gathered. She made multiple copies of the photos and documents, storing them in different locations, both physical and digital. She also sent a copy to a trusted contact outside the town, someone who could release the information if anything happened to her. She wasn't taking any chances. Next, she reached out to her lawyer, updating him on what she had found. He listened carefully, his tone growing more serious as she explained the extent of the corruption. "This is bigger than I thought," he said finally. "If this gets out, it's going to blow the lid off everything. But we need to be careful. If Victor finds out you're onto him, he'll do whatever it takes to silence you." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I know. That's why I need your help to get this to the right people. Someone who can't be bought or intimidated." Her lawyer hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "All right. I know a federal agent who's been investigating Victor for years. He's clean, and he's got the resources to take this down. But it's going to take time. You need to lay low until we can get everything in place." She agreed, but she knew laying low wouldn't be easy. Victor's men were already watching her, and it was only a matter of time before they made their move. She needed to stay one step ahead. Over the next few days, she kept a low profile, avoiding the shipping yard and staying out of sight. She changed her routine, never staying in one place for too long, and always keeping an eye out for anyone following her. She also began to prepare for the worst, gathering supplies and mapping out escape routes in case she needed to disappear. But despite her precautions, she knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. Victor's network was too powerful, and they had eyes everywhere. It was only a matter of time before they found her. That time came sooner than she expected. One evening, as she was leaving a small grocery store, she noticed a black sedan parked across the street. The engine was running, and the windows were tinted, but she could feel the eyes watching her. She didn't react, keeping her pace steady as she walked down the street. But when she turned the corner, she broke into a run, ducking into an alley and pressing herself against the wall. A few moments later, she heard footsteps approaching. She held her breath, her hand reaching for the small knife she always carried. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest, ready to strike if necessary. But no one came. After a few tense moments, she peeked around the corner and saw the sedan driving away. She let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding, but she knew this wasn't over. They were testing her, seeing how she would react. And they would be back. She returned to her apartment, locking the door behind her and pulling out her laptop. She needed to speed things up. The longer this dragged on, the more dangerous it became. She sent a message to her lawyer, urging him to move faster. She also reached out to the man from the cafe, the one who had offered to help her. She still didn't trust him, but she needed all the allies she could get. "I need your help," she told him over the phone. "Victor's men are on to me. I don't know how much time I have." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a slow, deliberate response. "I'll do what I can. But you need to be ready. Things are about to get messy." She didn't like the sound of that, but she didn't have a choice. She was in too deep to back out now. The next morning, she received a call from her lawyer. "I've got good news and bad news," he said. "The good news is, the federal agent is on board. He's ready to move as soon as we give him the evidence. The bad news is, Victor's men are closing in. They know you're onto them, and they're not going to wait." She felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept her voice steady. "How much time do we have?" "Not much," he admitted. "A day, maybe 2. You need to get out of there. Find somewhere safe and stay there until this is over." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I'll figure something out. Just make sure the evidence gets to the right people." As she hung up the phone, she began to pack a small bag with essentials, clothes, cash, and a few weapons. She knew she couldn't stay in her apartment much longer. It was only a matter of time before Victor's men came for her. But as she was about to leave, she heard a noise outside her door. She froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife at her side. The noise came again, a soft, deliberate knock. She moved silently to the door, peering through the peephole. Standing outside was the man from the cafe, his expression grim. "Open up," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We don't have much time." She hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the door and let him in. He stepped inside, glancing around the apartment before turning to face her. "They're coming," he said without preamble. "Victor's men. They know where you are, and they're on their way. You need to leave. Now." She didn't argue. She grabbed her bag and followed him out of the apartment, staying close as they moved down the stairs and out into the alley behind the building. He led her to a waiting car, its engine running and the driver's seat empty. "Get in," he said, handing her the keys. "Drive to this address." He handed her a piece of paper with an address scrawled on it. "It's a safe house. You'll be safe there until this is over." She took the keys and the paper, but she didn't move. "What about you?" He shook his head. "I've got my own part to play in this. Just go. And be careful." She nodded, then got into the car and drove off, her mind racing. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she didn't have a choice. She needed to get to safety. As she drove, she kept an eye on the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of pursuit. But the streets were quiet, and she made it to the safe house without incident. It was a small, nondescript building on the edge of town, surrounded by trees and hidden from view. She parked the car and went inside, locking the door behind her. The place was sparsely furnished but secure, with heavy curtains covering the windows and a sturdy deadbolt on the door. She set her bag down and began to settle in, knowing she might be here for a while. But as she sat there in the quiet, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. Victor and his network were powerful, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. She would need to be ready for anything. And she would need to be ready to fight back. The safe house was quiet, almost unnervingly so. She spent the first few hours securing the place, checking every window, door, and corner to ensure no one could sneak in. She set up makeshift alarms using empty cans and string, positioned near the entry points. It wasn't high-tech, but it would give her a warning if someone tried to break in. She also barricaded the doors with heavy furniture, just in case. As the hours dragged on, she tried to stay busy. She reviewed the evidence she had gathered, organizing it into a clear, concise report. She knew the federal agent would need everything laid out perfectly to take down Victor and his network. She also kept in touch with her lawyer, who assured her that the agent was working quickly to build a case. But time was running out, and she could feel the tension building with every passing minute. That night, as she sat on the floor with her back against the wall, she heard a noise outside. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but her training had sharpened her senses. She froze, listening intently. The sound came again, a soft crunch of gravel underfoot. Someone was outside. She moved silently to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the yard. At first, she saw nothing. Then, a figure emerged from the trees, moving cautiously toward the house. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing and carrying something in his hand. She couldn't see what it was, but she didn't need to. She knew why he was here. She grabbed the knife she had placed nearby and positioned herself near the door, waiting. The man approached slowly, his footsteps barely audible. She could hear him fumbling with the lock, trying to pick it. She held her breath, her grip tightening on the knife. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. The man stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. He didn't see her at first, but when he turned, she was already moving. She lunged at him, tackling him to the ground and pressing the knife to his throat. "Who sent you?" she demanded, her voice low and steady. The man struggled, but she pressed the knife harder, drawing a thin line of blood. "Victor," he gasped. "He sent me to bring you in." She didn't hesitate. With a quick, precise movement, she knocked him unconscious. She didn't have time to waste. If Victor's men had found the safe house, it was only a matter of time before more showed up. She dragged the man into a closet and tied him up with some rope she found in the kitchen. Then she grabbed her bag and prepared to leave. But as she reached for the door, she heard more noises outside. This time, it wasn't just one person. It was several. She cursed under her breath and moved to the back of the house, peering out the window. There were at least 3 men outside, all armed and moving toward the house. She was outnumbered and outgunned, but she wasn't about to go down without a fight. She quickly formulated a plan. The safe house had a small basement with a hidden exit that led to the woods. If she could make it there, she might be able to escape. But she would need to create a distraction first. She grabbed a bottle of cleaning alcohol from under the sink and poured it over a rag, then lit it on fire. She threw it toward the front door, where it landed with a burst of flames. The men outside shouted in surprise, their attention drawn to the fire. While they were distracted, she slipped out the back and into the basement. The hidden exit was just as she remembered, a small, narrow tunnel that led to the edge of the woods. She crawled through it as quickly as she could, emerging on the other side just as she heard the men breaking into the house. She didn't look back. She ran through the woods, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew they would be after her soon, and she needed to put as much distance between herself and the safe house as possible. After what felt like an eternity, she reached a small road. She crouched behind a tree, catching her breath and scanning the area. There was no sign of pursuit, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down. She needed to find a way out of town, somewhere Victor's men couldn't reach her. As she was trying to decide her next move, she heard the sound of a car approaching. She tensed, ready to run, but then she recognized the vehicle. It was the man from the cafe, the one who had helped her before. He pulled up beside her and rolled down the window. "Get in," he said, his voice urgent. "We don't have much time." She hesitated for a moment, then climbed into the passenger seat. He drove off quickly, his eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion. "I've been keeping an eye on you," he admitted. "I knew Victor's men would come after you, and I couldn't let them get to you. Not when you're so close to bringing him down." She didn't respond, her mind racing. She still didn't trust him completely, but she didn't have many options. She needed his help if she was going to survive this. "Where are we going?" she asked finally. "Somewhere safe," he said. "A place Victor's men won't find you. But we need to move fast. They're not going to stop until they've got you." She nodded, leaning back in her seat and closing her eyes for a moment. She was exhausted, but she couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. As they drove, she thought about everything that had happened. She had come so far, uncovered so much, but the hardest part was still ahead. Victor and his network were powerful, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. She would need to be ready for anything. And she would need to be ready to fight back. The car sped through the winding backroads, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife. She sat in the passenger seat, her eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Every shadow, every flicker of movement made her tense. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The man from the cafe, she still didn't know his name, kept his focus on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He hadn't said much since she got in the car, and she didn't press him. She was too busy trying to piece together her next move. "Where exactly are we going?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. "Somewhere safe," he repeated, his tone clipped. "A place Victor's men won't think to look. But we need to be careful. They've got eyes everywhere." She nodded, though his vagueness didn't sit well with her. She didn't like being kept in the dark, especially when her life was on the line. But for now, she had no choice but to trust him. She was out of options. After about an hour of driving, they pulled up to an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was surrounded by a chain-link fence, and the windows were boarded up. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. "This is your idea of safe?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's not much to look at," he admitted, "but it's secure. And more importantly, Victor doesn't know about it." They got out of the car and made their way inside. The warehouse was dimly lit, with only a few flickering fluorescent lights illuminating the space. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was littered with debris. But as they moved deeper into the building, she noticed something that made her pause. In the center of the warehouse was a makeshift command center, a table covered with maps, photos, and documents, along with a laptop and a few radios. It was clear that this place wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. He hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "This is where I've been working. I've been trying to take down Victor for years, but I've never had enough evidence. Until now." She studied him carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. "So, what's your plan?" He walked over to the table and picked up a photo of Victor, his expression grim. "Victor's hosting a fundraiser tomorrow night. It's his annual charity gala, and all the big players in town will be there. Cops, politicians, business owners, everyone who's part of his network. If we can get inside, we can expose him in front of everyone." She crossed her arms over her chest, her mind racing. "And how do you plan to do that? It's not like we can just walk in." He smirked, pulling out 2 invitations from his pocket. "We're not going to walk in. We're going to blend in." She took one of the invitations, studying it carefully. It was an elegant card, embossed with gold lettering and the logo of Victor's charity. "Where did you get these?" "Let's just say I have my sources," he said cryptically. "But we'll need to be careful. Victor's security is tight, and if they catch us, we're dead." She nodded, her mind already working on a plan. "All right. But if we're doing this, we do it my way. No unnecessary risks." He raised an eyebrow. "And what's your way?" She walked over to the table, scanning the maps and documents. "We need to know the layout of the venue, the security measures, and Victor's schedule. We also need a way to get the evidence out if things go south." He nodded, clearly impressed. You've done this before, haven't you? She didn't respond, her focus entirely on the task at hand. Over the next few hours, they worked together, planning every detail of the operation. She used her training to identify potential entry and exit points, while he provided insider knowledge about the venue and the guests. By the time they were finished, they had a solid plan. They would pose as guests, using the invitations to get inside. Once inside, they would plant a series of small recording devices throughout the venue, capturing any incriminating conversations. They would also confront Victor directly, forcing him to reveal his crimes in front of everyone. It was risky, but it was their best shot. And she knew they didn't have much time. Victor's men were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they found her. The next evening, they arrived at the gala, dressed in formal attire and carrying forged IDs. The venue was a sprawling mansion on the edge of town, surrounded by lush gardens and towering gates. Security was tight, with armed guards patrolling the perimeter and checking every guest's invitation. As they approached the entrance, she felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The moment of truth. The guard at the door took their invitations, studying them carefully before nodding and stepping aside. They walked in, blending seamlessly with the other guests. The inside of the mansion was even more opulent than the outside, with crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and walls adorned with expensive artwork. She kept her head down, her eyes constantly scanning the room. She spotted Victor almost immediately, standing near the center of the room and surrounded by a group of admirers. He looked every bit the powerful businessman, his smile charming but his eyes cold and calculating. "There he is," she whispered, nodding in Victor's direction. Her companion followed her gaze, his expression hardening. "Let's stick to the plan. We'll plant the devices first, then confront him." They split up, moving through the crowd and placing the recording devices in strategic locations. She moved quickly but carefully, her training allowing her to avoid detection. Within minutes, they had planted all the devices and regrouped near the edge of the room. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let's do this." They made their way toward Victor, weaving through the crowd. As they approached, Victor noticed them and his smile faltered for a moment. But he quickly recovered, extending his hand in greeting. "I don't believe we've met," he said, his tone polite but guarded. She shook his hand, her grip firm. "We haven't. But I think you'll want to hear what we have to say." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't respond. Instead, he gestured for them to follow him to a quieter corner of the room. Once they were out of earshot, he turned to face them, his expression cold. "Who are you, and what do you want?" he demanded. She didn't flinch. "We're here to expose you. We know about your illegal operations, and we have the evidence to prove it." Victor's eyes flicked to her companion, then back to her. "You're bluffing." She shook her head, pulling out a small device and pressing a button. A recording of Victor's voice filled the air, detailing his involvement in the smuggling ring. The color drained from his face as he realized what was happening. "You're finished," she said, her voice steady. "It's over." But before Victor could respond, the room erupted into chaos. The lights flickered, and the sound of shouting filled the air. She turned just in time to see a group of armed men storming into the room, their guns drawn. Victor smirked, his confidence returning. "You really thought you could take me down? You're out of your league." She didn't have time to respond. The men were closing in, and she knew they had only seconds to act. She grabbed her companion's arm and pulled him toward the nearest exit, her mind racing. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but she wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not when they were so close. As they ran through the mansion, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. They would need to fight their way out, and it wouldn't be easy. But she was ready. She had faced worse odds before, and she wasn't about to let Victor win. The mansion was in chaos. Guests screamed and scattered as Victor's armed men stormed through the room, their guns raised. She didn't have time to think, only to act. Grabbing her companion's arm, she pulled him toward the nearest exit, her mind racing through the layout of the building they had studied earlier. "This way," she shouted over the noise, darting down a narrow hallway. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, heavy and urgent. Victor's men were closing in. They burst through a side door and into the mansion's sprawling gardens. The cool night air hit her face as she sprinted across the manicured lawn, her companion close behind. The gardens were dimly lit, with tall hedges and statues casting long shadows. It was the perfect place to lose pursuers, if they moved fast enough. "We need to split up," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "It'll make it harder for them to track us." Her companion nodded, his face pale but determined. "Meet back at the warehouse. And be careful." Without another word, they veered off in opposite directions. She ducked behind a hedge, crouching low as she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Two of Victor's men ran past, their voices sharp and panicked. She waited until they were out of sight, then slipped deeper into the gardens. Her training kicked in as she moved silently through the shadows, her senses heightened. She knew the layout of the gardens from the maps they had studied, and she used that knowledge to her advantage. She avoided the main paths, sticking to the darker, less traveled areas. Every few steps, she paused to listen, her ears straining for any sign of pursuit. After what felt like an eternity, she reached the edge of the property. The high stone wall that surrounded the mansion loomed ahead, its surface slick with moss. She glanced around, making sure the coast was clear, then began to climb. Her muscles burned with the effort, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. When she reached the top, she paused for a moment, scanning the area on the other side. The street below was quiet, with no sign of Victor's men. She dropped down onto the pavement, landing in a crouch, then took off running. The warehouse was several miles away, but she didn't dare risk calling for a ride. She stuck to the backstreets, moving quickly but cautiously. Every shadow, every sound made her tense, but she forced herself to keep going. She couldn't afford to stop. Not now. When she finally reached the warehouse, she was exhausted but relieved. Her companion was already there, pacing nervously near the entrance. He looked up as she approached, his expression a mix of relief and frustration. "I thought they got you," he said, his voice tight. She shook her head, catching her breath. "Not yet. But we're not out of the woods. Victor's not going to let this go." He nodded, his face grim. "I know. But we've got the evidence. We just need to get it to the right people." They went inside, and she immediately began gathering the recordings and documents they had collected. Her mind was already working on the next step. They needed to get the evidence to the federal agent her lawyer had contacted, but doing so wouldn't be easy. Victor's network was vast, and they would be watching every move. "We need to move fast," she said, her voice urgent. "Victor's men will be looking for us, and they'll know we're trying to get this evidence out." Her companion nodded, pulling out his phone. "I'll call the agent. He can meet us somewhere safe." While he made the call, she packed the evidence into a small, waterproof bag. She also grabbed a few supplies, food, water, and a change of clothes. She didn't know how long they would be on the run, but she wanted to be prepared. When her companion hung up, he turned to her, his expression serious. "The agent's on his way. He's meeting us at an old diner on the edge of town. It's neutral ground, Victor's men won't expect us to be there." She nodded, slinging the bag over her shoulder. "Let's go." They left the warehouse and drove to the diner, keeping a low profile. The streets were quiet, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every car that passed made her tense, every shadow seemed to move. She knew it was just her nerves, but she couldn't help it. The stakes were too high. When they arrived at the diner, the federal agent was already there, sitting in a booth near the back. He was a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, and he nodded as they approached. "You've got the evidence?" he asked, his voice low. She handed him the bag, her hands steadied despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Everything you need to take Victor down. But you need to move fast. He's not going to wait." The agent nodded, his expression grim. "I'll take it from here. You've done your part." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Just make sure he pays for what he's done." The agent gave her a small, reassuring smile. "He will. You have my word." As they left the diner, she felt a strange mix of relief and unease. They had done everything they could, but the fight wasn't over yet. Victor was still out there, and he wouldn't stop until he had silenced them for good. They returned to the warehouse, but she knew they couldn't stay there for long. Victor's men would be searching for them, and it was only a matter of time before they found the place. They needed to disappear, at least until Victor was arrested. "What now?" her companion asked, his voice tinged with exhaustion. She sat down on the edge of the table, her mind racing. "We lay low. Somewhere Victor's men won't think to look. And we wait." He nodded, sinking into a chair. "And if the agent doesn't come through?" She didn't answer right away. The thought had crossed her mind, but she pushed it aside. They had done everything they could. Now, it was out of their hands. "He'll come through," she said finally, her voice firm. "And if he doesn't, we'll find another way. But for now, we need to stay alive." The next few days were tense. They moved from place to place, never staying in one spot for too long. She kept a close eye on the news, waiting for any sign that Victor had been arrested. But the days passed, and there was nothing. Just when she was starting to lose hope, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her lawyer. "It's done. Victor's been arrested." The evidence was enough. She felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. Victor's network was vast, and while his arrest was a major blow, it didn't mean they were out of danger. There were still people out there who wanted her silenced. But for now, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. They had done it. They had taken down one of the most powerful men in the town, and they had survived. As she sat there, her companion walked over, a small smile on his face. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. She nodded, returning his smile. "We did. But this isn't over." "Not yet." He nodded, his expression serious. "I know. But for now, let's just enjoy the win." She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. The fight wasn't over, but they had won a major battle. And for now, that was enough.